Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hi all of you there. Well, how did you find our novel Animal Farm? Did you find it interesting? And I hope by now all of you have read it, because you'd be missing something remarkable if you don't read this novel. Not just an exercise in acquiring linguistic competency. Of course, that's also true. When you read this novel, you would invariably come across some extraordinary words that George Orwell contributed, including in fact I said in the previous class that we make use of this adjective called Orwellian. Orwell's contribution to English literature is remarkable, of course, through his two significant novels, Animal Farm and 1984. More than that, some extraordinary words that have now become an integral part of any discourse on democracy, any system, any discourse on governance. There are some words now they are contributed by Animal Farm, and not just necessarily in Animal Farm, but of course George Orwell contributes these words in various his articles, essays and radio interviews and other things. For instance, when you and I hear the word Big Brother, right, obviously it's a contribution by George Orwell, especially used in his extraordinary novel 1984. Or doublespeak, when you hear the word doublespeak, it's by George Orwell, something like that. And his contribution to our contemporary discourse on governance and administration, it's unparalleled. So I am sure for all these reasons you would find reading George Orwell and especially Animal Farm very enriching and also very entertaining, because the novel is very short to begin with. You can target reading it in one sitting or just a couple of sittings, not more than that. Hardly about 100 to 120 pages, depending on which edition you are holding in your hands. More than that, it's a remarkable classic. As we defined classic in one of our previous classes, classic is a work of art which despite reading several times does not lose its significance. The more you read, the more you uncover. So Animal Farm lends itself into that kind of tradition. Now recall, now in this class what we are going to do, now that we have discussed the novel chapter by chapter and also analyzed the novel in terms of its character representations, settings, ideals, dreams and vision. In this chapter we are going to throw a little bit more light on the structural components of the novel and the narrative techniques used here and the plot structures. We are going to analyze Animal Farm from literary techniques perspective and also from the elements of fiction perspective. You can quickly recall those two classes or those 2 weeks where we discussed extensively various techniques used in fiction and various elements that are found in fiction. Now let us see how much of it we can apply it here, so that it becomes easier for you when you read any other novel and when you want to analyze it. This class should definitely help you in doing that. Okay. Now I said that novel, any fictional work is basically a made up work. It's in fiction we said that in fiction, a fiction is a series of lies which hides within its core the seed of truth, right. This is more or less many of the writers have expressed it. Fiction is a series of lies which hides within its core an element of truth. Now, how is it? Because entire fiction itself, as I said, fiction's contribution to unraveling truth is immense. We discussed this with particular reference to a couple of remarkable lines by major writers, remember. Now, let us see how it holds good. Now, look at this, you read a novel here, right. Now, this novel states that it is set in a farm, a farmland or an animal farm somewhere in England, which is again a lie, right. Why is it a lie? Now, supposing you change this setting from England to, let us say, India or to China, Japan, Russia, France, Germany, wherever you want it, even Finland, wherever you want it, you can change it. Do you still think the novel would be as enjoyable as it is right now? Obviously, it should be, because the setting was only a prop the writer used in order to uncover something more. Of course, the setting was important for us because all the characters, they reside there, all major events unfold there, the story happens there, setting is very, very important and it is an integral component of fiction, right. But if you change that setting mentioned in this novel from England to United States of America, Russia, Finland, Argentina, any other country, do you still think the novel would be as enjoyable as it is now? Obviously, it would be as enjoyable as it is now, right. So, therefore, setting was a lie, that element is a lie. Now, look at the characters, setting again one of the elements of fiction, right. Now, look at the characters, another element of fiction. Now, instead of calling Squealer, if we called Squealer a wheeler, do you still think the novel would be as significant as it is now? Obviously. Instead of calling Napoleon, Napoleon, if you were to call Napoleon, let us say for instance Bonaparte, or let us say for instance XYZ, would it still give the meaning? Of course, it would still give the meaning, because there is nothing sacrosanct, there is nothing sacred attached to the name Napoleon there. Napoleon becomes important in the novel because of his actions, because of his fallen standards. Otherwise, you call Napoleon by any other name, the character would be as dense, as thick, as important to the novel as it is now. Now, replace let us say Muriel with any other name, it is still relevant, right. Replace Boxer, boxer, replace boxer with, let us say for instance Mr. Perfect or Hard Work, he would still have the same characteristic features. Therefore, the characters there, it is a lie. The significance of the significance of the novel is not there in the setting, not there in the characters, but it is in the characteristic features, which is different from the characters, right. It is again characters are a lie. Now, look at the third one, what is it called? Now, the story, of course, it is an integral part of the story. As I said, if you slightly rearrange the sequence of this story, would something happen? Of course, to a certain extent, the dramatic effect and other things might vary, but still the total vision that is now a part of this novel would remain the same thing, right. The total vision or the total theme which is now a part of the story still remains the same thing, right. Now, that is why I said through a series of lies, look how the novel unfolds the element of truth. What is the element of truth that the novel is talking of? The element of truth the novel is talking of is elsewhere. Of course, it is there in the novel, but more than in the novel, it is also outside it. What is outside it? So now, remember, without even uttering the word Russia anywhere here, without taking up the name of Stalin, without taking up the name of Lenin, without taking up the name of Karl Marx, without taking up the name of communism, look how closely the novel foreshadows all the elements that we have discussed here, and how it resonates with the meaning which is outside the text. Now, here we can quickly recall what the renowned French philosopher Jacques Derrida says. He, in one of his significant essays, he calls, it is a kind of a paradoxical statement, see if it makes any sense to you. He says, in any structure, center is very important, right? In any structure, center is very important, and generally speaking, center is within structure, but paradoxically the center is also outside the structure. What do you mean by this? Now look at this. He says center is important in any structure. When you say any structure, pick a rectangle squared object, a triangle squared object, a chair or a clock or a camera, anything, right? So if that is a structure, the center of the structure must be somewhere there, if not exactly in the center, at least somewhere in the periphery, right? Depending on the weight distribution in the object, somewhere it must be there. How can the center be outside the structure? In order to understand this, we need to come out of our limited doctrined Euclidean dimension into non-Euclidean dimension, right? In geometry, the Euclidean dimension, to outside it in order to understand the statement, it is only in Euclidean dimension that center is part of the structure. When we come out of it, it becomes clear. How is it? Now look at this. As I said, the truth here is a part of, when you complete reading this work, truth emerges, but the center, because it discusses the pitfalls of authoritarianism, especially by closely resonating with the dream turned sour of the Soviet revolution. So without even mentioning it there, how it critiques what happened in history. So therefore the center is not just within the novel. Of course we find shades of it within the novel, but it acquires a meaning when we read it outside the text. So if text is a structure, what gives it a center is this philosophy, and this philosophy and thick historical shades that we discussed now, they are not even discussed in the novel. It does not even utter the word Russia. Therefore you can say that the real center of this particular text is, partly it is there in the novel, but the predominant part of this center is outside the text. So this is how literature works, this is how humanities works. That is the reason why humanities is called discipline of the intuition. Intuitive sciences, humanities is called a discourse of the intuitive sciences, and intuition you can't define in a you can't pinpoint it in a fixed way. And when you read Animal Farm, it gives you a rich template for us to discuss the scope of humanities, what arts does, responsibilities of the intelligentsia, and when an intelligentsia which is entrusted with the responsibility of running a governance or providing light to society, when it becomes corrupt, what happens? The novel provides us ample opportunities for us to discuss all these things in in its short length and breadth, right. So let us pick up our discussion of Animal Farm. More than that, let us try to understand how George Orwell comes to write this novel. We already we know some details about George Orwell. Of course, after he resigns from the Indian Civil Service, he goes on to join BBC as a kind of freelance writer. He was also a journalist, remember, and during the World War, in order to counter the effective propaganda unleashed by Germany, in fact behind the success of the Nazi Germany at that point of time, the role of propaganda is immense, right. The role of propaganda is immense, like propaganda, squealer, how squealer is important in the novel. There too propaganda, in order to counter the very effective propaganda machinery, BBC enlisted the service of George Orwell, right. So George Orwell helped BBC in countering the propaganda machinery of Germany and Japan, using his linguistic ability, language ability, skills and all that. He helped play a major role. That is why if you find in his fiction a lucid style, and yet dense meanings. That's because he had an exposure to journalistic writing, where he had to, of course, write in a simple language some extraordinary truths, especially during the war times. So his experience there plays a major role. Now, we discussed how Animal Farm wonderfully succeeds in continuing the legacy of political allegory. Now, looked at from another angle, in fact, we can also trace the genesis of Orwell's this particular novel to Thomas More's Utopia, published in the early part of the 16th century, an extraordinary work. In fact, Utopia is a dream kingdom. Today, when we say utopia, it means a dream kingdom. In fact, Thomas More, an extraordinary political philosopher, when he was fed up with the governance, when he was fed up with monarchy, then he came out with a pamphlet, which envisioned a system of governance where everybody was treated in an equal way. Probably you find the seeds of egalitarianism in Western discourse too. If you can trace it back, you can trace it back to More's Utopia, written in 1516, right. So utopia can be, the equivalent would be something like Ramarajya, what we call Ramarajya in our context, it's called utopia. Animal Farm, when it begins, the revolution, now look at the words, the words of the old major, it begins with the dream of setting up utopia, right. The ideals of the revolution, the ideals of the ideology, or when the old major gives a speech, he wants to set up a system of governance that treats every animal equally, fairly, and an equitable way. Now look how it turns. That's utopia. But unfortunately, because that utopia, the vision could not factor in or did not factor in the realities, because ultimately when a dream is to be realized, it has to be, dream is in another dimension, reality is in another dimension. When you have to translate your dream into a reality, you have to factor in lot many things, right. Idea alone is not sufficient. So where does that great ideology fail? Maybe it did not take into consideration the practical feasibilities of that, or we don't know, or it does not even take into consideration human nature, which is basically susceptible to corruption. Otherwise, all of them who participated in that great revolution, who were, who had great dreams, how could they turn so bad? At the end of the day, how could they turn so bad? So probably George Orwell realized, he had a first-hand account of how, those who talk big themselves have baser instincts and baser feelings. In fact, his exposure to the leadership of Europe, especially Hitler, he had seen the working style of Hitler, Mussolini, and all of them. So he was truly disillusioned with the grandiloquence of their speech and the naked reality and the totalitarian instincts, That's the reason why he wrote it. So when somebody asks him, why he wrote Animal Farm or what he did there, he seemed to have remarked that Animal Farm is the first book in which I tried with full consciousness and vigor what I was doing. And what was he doing? His intention in the novel was to fuse the political purpose with the artistic purpose, so that he could expose the doublespeak, hypocrisy of the totalitarian regimes. Now look at, if you analyze, if you parse the speeches of any great dictator, it is filled with grand vision. It is filled with grand vision, but when you parse it, it is marked by cruelty. It is marked by insensitivity towards the feelings of fellow citizens. It is marked by duplicity, because they themselves do not follow the ideals they preach. There is a huge gap between what they preach and what they practice. So Orwell had seen all that, and that's the reason why he said that he wanted to fuse political purpose with artistic purpose. probably, I mean, it's true that you find thick shades of Orwell's political ideology in the novel. That may be the reason why during his lifetime the novel did not attain the kind of fame it later attained, because it was considered a propaganda work. And of course, Orwell also believed in in the ideology that he wanted the novel to be, he believed in democratic ideals, and he did not believe in totalitarian regimes, and that is what he wanted to do in his novel, through his novel, right. So many considered this novel as a propaganda literature. So any propaganda literature, obviously, of course, like any ideological literature, it is guided by the ideology, but it may not be guided by the artistic merits, the aesthetic principles that should otherwise govern a work of art. That may be the reason why it was not considered a major novel until, let us say, the second part of the 20th century discovered its greatness, right. And he also seemed to have said, when somebody asks him what he did in Animal Farm, he said that he wanted to write a book in a simple language, and he wanted to tell ordinary English people who had enjoyed the tradition of justice and liberty for centuries what a totalitarian system was like. Well, we do not know how honest or authentic Orwell is here, because he says that England itself was enjoyed tradition of justice and liberty for centuries. We do not know whether we can take this particular line at its face value, because if England had enjoyed justice and liberty for centuries, there was no need for Thomas More to have written Utopia as a rebellious piece against monarchy. So we do not know that, whether it is a tongue-in-cheek comment, or whether, of course, it is again a political shrewdness that Orwell came to later acquire. We do not know, right. So, but this is his comment, this is his comment when somebody asks him. Yeah, we have already discussed George Orwell's politics, and as I said, he was skeptical about the authoritarian political figures preaching extremely idealistic values and visions, because he had a brush with the personalities of Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini and others. He had seen how Spanish communists directed by Moscow betrayed their allies and all of these things. So you find thick shades of these historical events, including Stalin's infamous purge trials, like we saw Napoleon holding trials and decimating his enemies, killing his enemies. It has historical reference to Stalin holding purge trials and killing all his political adversaries, all those people who dissented to his regime, his ideologies and all that, So we have already discussed that in detail. Now let us quickly take up and dissect the novel in terms of its characters, elements and other things, because you can quickly recall, right. Of course, you still remember what we discussed about novel, its elements and techniques. Now let us try to analyze it. So when you analyze a novel, you have to analyze it in terms of characters. Who are the major characters in the novel? Of course, we had discussed it, remember, we had introduced you to major characters in the novel and what is their characteristic features. So you will have to discuss that. In what way do they contribute to the narrative and theme, because ultimately, remember, we had also said character is plot, plot is character, a statement by Scott Fitzgerald. In fact, that is a remarkable statement, because it shows to what extent character and plot are fused together. They are not separate elements. Of course, they are two different elements, but in the hands of an able writer, they are fused so densely together that you may not be able to distinguish between them, whether it has happened here or not. What are the different elements? When we say different elements like character, what is the theme here, what is the conflict, what is the tone, what is the style, what is the setting? Can you think of it? Now, when it comes to types of fiction, we discussed various genres of fiction, right. Of course, we said it's a political satire, but it can also be read as an historical fiction, because you find thick shades of history here. Therefore, you can call it historical fiction, but you can't end just there, because it is not just an historical fiction. Well, it also makes use of elements from allegory. It also makes use of elements from fable. So you can call it an allegory, but it is not an allegory in a regular sense, because here it is political allegory, therefore, can you call it a political allegory? Well, of course, you can call all that, and simultaneously it is also part of the mainstream fiction, right, because it went out of its limited boundary of literary fiction and came to be defined as a major classic of the 20th century, right. Today, as I said, whether anybody has read Dickens or not, whether anybody has read Balzac or not, whether anybody has read Tolstoy or not, or Dostoevsky or not, they will have read George Orwell, especially Animal Farm in 1984, right. That is the reason why it has now become a part of the mainstream fiction. So, you can look at all these things, right. This is how we analyze a work of art. Now, in terms of elements of a novel, of course, we discussed the plot, we discussed the characters, we discussed even the setting, and we discussed the conflict, because what is the central there are a lot of conflicts here. In fact, the conflict takes place between Jones and animals, animals and Jones and his friends, and conflict within animals and all these things. But basically, the central conflict here is the desire of the animals and their collective aspiration towards freedom and equality, vis-a-vis how that ideal is corrupted by greed and political power that gets consolidated in the hands of a few. Here in this novel, it is pigs. Now, what is the point of view? We discussed point of view as an important element of fiction, right. So, here is a third person narrative, an omniscient narrator, and we discussed third person narrative. Third person narrative is where somebody, as if they can see the inner workings of these characters and their minds, they start describing it. The third person starts describing the events as they see it. So, therefore, third person. What is the style here? Of course, if you look at the language, we already identified it as lucid prose. Therefore, it makes use of a simple fable, simple story, lucid style, and when it comes to language, again simple language, easy to understand vocabulary and all that. And what is the tone here? Tone is very playful initially, because playful and light, which gradually becomes serious, and towards the end it turns to become very dark and violent. That is the tone, because that is why I said. Now, remember, there was a poem we read, right, What Happens to a Dream Deferred. We read a poem, What Happens to a Dream Deferred, by Langston Hughes, while discussing American poetry. Now, think of what happens to a dream that turns sour. What happens to a dream that turned sour? Do you think you can write a poem on that? That is precisely what happened here, right? A dream turned sour, a dream turned a nightmare, a dream turned nightmare. Now, what is the theme here, which is another crucial element of fiction? Well, the theme, the overall theme is it is independent of the plot that we have already discussed in the class. It is the theme of the novel is to discuss the evils, the tyranny of totalitarian regimes and dictatorship, and also to discuss how an extraordinary dream, a vision becomes a nightmare here, something like this. So, this is how we analyze various elements of fiction vis-a-vis this particular novel. Now, look at plot overview. We discussed Freytag's pyramid. Now, if you can apply that Freytag's pyramid here, so this is how you can do it. Exposition, right, in the very first character, very first chapter, exposition takes place, right. All the characters are introduced, their plight, their suffering is introduced, and you are also introduced to the characteristic features of Mr. Jones, how he is abusive, alcoholic and all that. So, that, and also you are introduced to the grand vision that the old major has for all the animals, that is exposition, right. What is the rising action? And before that, there is a minor inciting incident and rising action, you can club it together. The rising action happens when Jones forgets to feed the animals, goes to sleep, and when animals are eating on their own, he wants to come and abuse them, and that is when, of course, there is a conflict, and the plot is begins the seriousness in the seriousness quotient of the plot gets thicker and thicker. That is the rising action. What is climax here, which is the third element? Climax happens when Snowball wants to consolidate the power, as a result of which, I am sorry, Napoleon wants to consolidate his power, as a result of which he succeeds in driving Snowball, who is a major political opponent, he drives him away by using unfair means. He chases, by showing his dogs to and he chases Snowball away from the farm. That is the climax. And falling action begins from chapter 6 onwards. Remember, when he wants to have truck with the human world, he wants to sell eggs, which was prohibited earlier. They did not want to do anything with human beings, but he appoints a solicitor to facilitate the trade between this particular farm and others. Falling action happens, and that again towards the end what happens, there is supposed to be resolution. What is the resolution here? Do you think it is resolved? Well, resolved, it need not always be resolved in a positive way. Unfortunately, the dream could not be materialized. That is how it is resolved. What is resolved? The pigs, all the animals that detested human beings, now the pigs which championed that particular cause right in the beginning, now they start imitating human beings, and towards the end it so much happens that the rest of the animals cannot distinguish between pigs and human beings, because the transformation of the pigs to becoming humans is total. So, what is the novel trying to say? It is a kind of a big circle, it comes back to square one, because towards the end you find Napoleon changing even the name of this particular farm from Animal Farm to the earlier name, the Manor Farm. So, even the name has been changed. Look how beautifully the plot begins from point A, takes it through a particular circle and comes back and joins there, huge circle, square, back to square one. That is the statement we have, right? It comes back to the square one. All these things are important things we have discussed in the novel. Okay. And we also discussed the various representations of the characters, how Napoleon represents Stalin, Snowball represents Trotsky, Squealer represents the media here, and the major stands for Karl Marx and a combination of Karl Marx and Lenin, and all these things, while Boxer represents the working class and how their contribution is also ignored. Rest of it we have discussed it. And human beings here in the novel come to symbolize oppression and meanness and even opportunism, because towards the end Pikington, of course, Pikington is a caricature of Winston Churchill of England, so they want to have, though they detest Animal Farm and though they do not want their own animals to follow the animals here in the Animal Farm, they want to have some business with Animal Farm. So, it also talks about the double standards, the double standardness and duplicity of these kind of leaders. So, all these things are discussed here in the novel. I am sure you must have enjoyed reading it. Of course, we discussed it. It is a satire, a political satire, and all these things, and we have also discussed how it is a political allegory, right. So, these are the various things you can analyze the novel from. I am just running you through these slides so that you also know. We have discussed these things during our discussion of the novel. You can just take a quick look at it. I am sure you enjoyed listening to Animal Farm, and I also want you to pick up the novel and read it in order to complete your experience of Animal Farm. There is no alternative to reading it first hand. So, please pick it up. All right. So, with this we are concluding our discussion of fiction. We began with introduction to fiction, definition of fiction, and we introduced the various components that constitute fiction. Then we discussed various branches of fiction. If fiction were to be a tree, the branches would mean types of fiction, and then the building blocks of fiction in terms of various elements that constitute fiction, and the narrative techniques that fiction writers employ in order to make their fiction more enriching and add layers of meaning, and also to captivate the attention of the audience and to make it more engaging, what kind of techniques the writers use. And finally, we applied all that we learnt about fiction by picking up a remarkable 20th century classic, Animal Farm, right. So, with this we complete our discussion of fiction, and in the next class we are going to pick up short fiction, all right. So, please recall all that you have learnt, and we will meet you again with short fiction in the next week. Okay? Thank you.